from the Psych Hub Podcast Network.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn Scully, and I use she, her, hers pronouns.
And I'm Cicada Fernandez-Turner, and I use they, them pronouns.
And this week we're hosting. Okay, I'm going to do 3, 2, 1. Cicada, and when I get to this one, we can try. Ready?
Okay.
3, 2.
Real talk with Gen Z.
Okay, that was good.
We attempted.
I can start off and tell everyone a little bit about myself. And as I said, my name is Carolyn Scully. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I'm currently speaking to you live from my 1-bedroom apartment with my small kitten, Mako, who's about 7 months old, and part-time with my girlfriend, Abby. I've been, as a member of the LGBTQ communities for as long as I can remember. I think even thinking back to having a crush on my 6th grade math teacher, who I really hope is not listening to this, because that would be really awkward.
Oh, of course.
So hopefully this doesn't come up in her Facebook ads or anything like that. And I came out more recently, about 2 years ago during COVID, from scrolling on TikTok, as crazy as that sounds. TikTok can teach us all these crazy things. And this is what has made me realize who I really was as a proud lesbian woman. And I've spent the last few years doing what I can to speak with my community and figuring out how I can be a better community member, ally, just supporter of this, and really speaker to what I can about my own mental health challenges too, both past and present. I've had them before I knew I was an LGBTQ member. I've had them after, as recently as my therapy appointment yesterday. So this is a struggle that we're all dealing with, and having conversations like these with you, Cicada, and our hosts and our guests today is something, a little bit of what I could do day to day to really, truly advocate and destigmatize some of these conversations.
So I am a 21-year-old artist from Tucson, Arizona, and I live with my cat Bamboozle. I do a lot of visual art, drawing, painting, music, poetry. I've been an outspoken member of the community for quite a few years. I started volunteering with different LGBT organizations when I was 17. I came out as trans when I was 16, as a lesbian when I was like 13 or 14. Always changing, never staying the same.
Yeah, thanks, Cicada. And I think this conversation is really important, not only obviously for the LGBTQ community and the Trevor Project hosting, but also just general teens going through this. Anyone who identifies with Gen Z, or even like the zillennial term that's also used, is we're all young. We're all going through these challenges. We're the first age with like social media. So like that's a whole nother added pressure that gets put on us from such an early age in our leapfrog technology days. So I think anyone listening to this, just keep that in mind, is this is not just for the queer community.
And that's why we are so lucky to have Chris Bright on the show.
We sure are. Chris Bright, she, her, is the Director of Public Training at the Trevor Project, the world's largest suicide prevention and crisis intervention organization for LGBTQ youth. Each year, they provide life-saving and life-affirming training for youth-serving professionals and adults. Chris identifies as trans and resides in Burbank, California, with her husband, Seth, and her dog, Asher. In her spare time, she enjoys theater, theme parks, and building large-scale Lego sets.
Now to our conversation with Chris Bright. Chris, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited for this conversation. I'm really excited to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to be here with you all.
So I guess we can kind of start with just a very high level description of what you do day to day and your role.
Sure. So the Trevor Project is the world's largest suicide prevention and crisis intervention organization for LGBTQ youth. We have a variety of services that support LGBTQ youth in their mental health. We have things like our Lifeline, chat, and text services, which allow young folks to reach out to the Trevor Project 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, in a way that feels most comfortable to them, whether that be picking up the phone and calling, or texting, or logging onto our website and chatting. All of those options allow them to connect to a trained counselor one-on-one, which allows them to sort of be met where they're at. We also have things like our advocacy team focusing on laws and policies that impact LGBTQ youth. We have our research team, which each year releases the largest of its kind annual national survey, really exploring LGBTQ youth and research that's pertinent to our community. And then, of course, there's my team, the education team at Trevor. We're focused on public education and educating folks about LGBTQ identities and mental health broadly.
That's really cool. I used the Trevor Project hotlines like several times. The text lines, the call lines, the chat line. I used them all because I was in an area that wasn't super accepting of LGBT people in general. I was initially outed in middle school, and that's not a fun time. And no time is a fun time to be outed, but middle school is like a whole other beast. So from there, I was really alone. I didn't have a lot of friends. But when I did eventually come out, I started feeling better internally, but like had the difficulties more external. And I think that's an issue with coming out, is really picking, especially in a harder place like where I was, picking, do you want that internal struggle or do you want that external struggle?
Yeah, honestly, it is so rare to be able to connect to folks all these years later and hear how they're doing or hear how reaching out to the Trevor Project impacted them. I'm so happy to hear that that was a meaningful and supportive part of your process, your life. And you're right, junior high, rough. Sometimes I just sort of don't, my brain is just like, you never went through junior high. It just didn't happen. It wasn't part of you, because it's just such a hard time in all of our lives, I feel like. So relate on that front.
Mm-hmm. Me too. And I think my journey kind of started a little bit after middle school. And I will equally say, Chris and Cicada, it was just as rough in high school and just that beginning of college. I think I had this idea that once I went through that next little phase of my life, like freshman year, day one, college, day one, it would all go away, and it didn't. My coming out experience was years long in the process. I came out to a few people, didn't even know what I was doing. I was just saying, hey, I have a crush on this girl. What does that mean? They didn't respond. They didn't know how to respond because they didn't even know what it was, nor did I. I was in an area that was pretty conservative and just not really educational of what it means to be LGBTQ or how to be an ally itself too. So it probably took me a good 6 years to really confidently say, I am queer, I am this, and this is who I am. And that wasn't until recently, 2 years ago. And so that's kind of started this journey. And I'm just amazed that everyone has had, or not everyone, but some other people have had similar experiences, and we all go through these things. And it's like a silent battle that sometimes we don't even know the person we're sitting next to is kind of going through it. And it doesn't all have to be negative or positive, but it really is just quite the journey for us all in different ways.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thing about coming out, is people assume that it's a one and done sort of thing. But in reality, we come out over and over and over again for the rest of our lives, especially as non-passing trans people, or I can speak for myself as a non-binary person. If I want someone to use my pronouns, I have to come out because no one's going to look at me and just assume they.
Yeah. And I think because society has this sort of default of you're straight, you're cisgender, and that's just what we will assume of everybody until they tell us otherwise. You're right. It becomes this sort of lifelong process. And honestly, there are times in your life where it's I'm not going to put in the work, right? I'm not going to go, I don't need to tell my barista my pronouns, or I don't want to correct some random stranger. And at the same time, it does mean that you get to let your guard down when you're around your chosen family, because it's you don't have to put in that work. You don't have to super think about it. It's just sort of you have your community and it's over. And that process is not happening constantly around your people. So that's something I think about a lot, about why chosen family is truly so important.
Let's define chosen family real quick for people who may not know what it means.
So chosen family is something that I think lots of different communities, lots of different groups of people have had to build into their coping strategy, build into their network and their relationships. So it's not just something you find within the LGBT community, But I do feel like you find it often in communities that are marginalized, that are likely to maybe experience rejection within their family that they were born within. And so the concept of chosen family is really born out of this idea that you don't have to be biologically related to someone for them to be your family, for them to be just as important to you as, family that you might be biologically related to. I'll also point out that I'm a foster parent. So chosen family for me has a big additional layer of importance because I think that sometimes you choose family in the moment, in the circumstances that you're in, with what you're going through. And that is okay as well, right? Like, when you have a new foster placement, it may be that you don't know them their entire lives, so that they move away from you, or they are not necessarily always connected to you. But in that moment, they are your family. And in that moment, you choose them. You wake up every day and choose them. And I think there's something so powerful and beautiful about chosen family.
I think what I like about it too is that it doesn't just limit yourself to, say, 4 or 5 people in your life that are your biological family. I think I find myself every day, whatever I'm doing, whether that's at school or in the workplace, finding people that I don't want to call like along with the chosen family and like my safe people. I hate to use that word with this context, but people who I'm really comfortable around, and I feel that internal safety to where I know I could share about my identity and who I am and face no judgment. And I think for me, finding those places, those little pockets of communities has really helped me as I've kind of gone through this.
So speaking of sort of coming out your entire life and what that feels like, what that looks like, I will say, because I didn't come out until college, I was put in private Christian education, like evangelical, elementary school, middle school, high school, and there were rules expressly forbidding LGBTQ identities all growing up, right? I just did not have access to express myself. And even though there were these times in my life where I was like, oh my gosh, you are super, super gay and super, super trans, I was still like, no, I can't be that, right? And then in college, I still went to a private evangelical university, but I just met other people like me and we got to talking and one thing led to another. And we were like, oh, we've been hiding this for way too long. And I'll say that like that experience of coming out, that experience of being like, this is who I am and that's okay, transformed my mental health in ways that I didn't even know, right? Like I didn't realize why I was anxious. I was just anxious, right? I didn't realize why I was feeling overwhelmed. I was just feeling overwhelmed. Honestly, the theme of my, like, I would say, like from 5 years old all the way to 20 years old, the theme of my life was just existential dread. I was just sitting there like, what horrible thing is about to happen to me? And then when I came out, it felt like this huge weight lifted. I don't know if you all can relate, but I felt like my mental health just did a 180, you know?
Exactly. I completely I get chills when you say like, oh, I just felt like a weight lifted off me. That's exactly how I felt. I remember I told my mom on FaceTime and she's angry at me for doing it on FaceTime because she wanted a one-on-one personal connection. So apparently she birthed me. She wants that. But I told her, and I just remember just crying and just those few words. It was so hard to say, but the second I said it, I felt like I could just breathe. Like, it's just like this invisible thing that you're just carrying day to day and no one knows, or they may not know that you're having this and you're carrying this weight. And the second you kind of relieve that pressure with your safe individuals and with your chosen family, like that's when things start to change. And that's when I started finding out things about myself I didn't even know existed. Exactly what you said, Chris. Like I used to be anxious. I still am pretty anxious, but now I'm anxious with a little bit of a lighter weight to carry, which has been so relieving.
I think just mentioning for a minute how important those words are and how much weight the words themselves have. Because at first I came out as a lesbian and I told my parents that I liked girls. I was never going to use the word lesbian, even though that's how I identified. I was never going to use the word because it felt too heavy and it felt like it was almost like a diagnosis. At the time, I didn't see the power that the label had. I only saw the constraint that I viewed because there was like this one view of what a lesbian should look like, and that's not what I look like. So I felt really out of place using the words. But then once I really embraced, and then again, when I came out as trans, I didn't use the word trans. I was like, I use these pronouns, but I didn't say that I'm trans because it felt too heavy for me for a minute. But absolutely now I embrace my labels, like, and I say them all the time, even just for fun. Sometimes I'll randomly come out to my friends through text just because I think it's funny. But it takes a really long time to get there with yourself. And I think a really important thing is to just allow ourselves the time to get there, because we assume that like the second we know, we should know right away. But I changed my labels so many times. I changed my name so many times and my pronouns. It can be really hard to know who we are, especially at such a young age. But at any age, it can be really difficult. And because I was sort of thrown into it when I was 13 and I really wasn't ready, it was very difficult for me to connect with the words.
You know, there's something you're saying that I'm really latching onto, which is like you're embracing the term label. And I feel like there's this movement within queer spaces of like, we don't need labels. We're nothing. We can be whatever we want, right? And honestly, disagree for a lot of people. I think for some people, a lack of labels is really transformative. But I believe that language is transformative. I believe that having language to talk about who we are, to talk about our interests, our hobbies, our identities, and the way that those identities intersect with one another matters. And that when you're younger and you don't have the language to talk about your feelings, and then that language is gifted to you, you're like, oh my gosh, that is what this is? This thing has a name? Like, I didn't even know that there were other people like me, right? And there's this sort of silly movement right now that's sort of like, oh, there's just so many more LGBTQ people all of a sudden. There definitely weren't all these LGBTQ people before. And I'm like, no, that is not what's happening. What's happening is people are realizing that the boxes that were created for them are not big enough for all their beauty. What people are realizing is that the narrow thing of this is the only way to be a man, this is the only way to be a woman, and you are one or the other, period, and for always, doesn't really fit for them. And that is why all of this language feels like it's cropped up. It's because a bunch of people woke up, looked around, and said, hold on, just because this system has existed for a while doesn't mean this system works for me. And let's be clear, this system has not existed for all of humankind. This system has changed century by century, decade by decade, culture by culture. There is not a one-to-one fit across the globe and across time for what it means to be any gender identity. And so it really frustrates me that this message is out there that like, oh, this is all new and this is just people trying to change things. No, this is people finally putting words to who they are that didn't exist before. And that is so powerful.
It's funny you say that, Chris, because it reminds me, I've only been out for 2 years. And what kind of led me to coming out was TikTok. I didn't even know that certain things were like normal. And I didn't know that people, and keep in mind, I was like fully almost done with college at this point, still not really understanding. I went to a very conservative college where LGBTQ education was not the norm. I did not really know. I didn't really think about these things. And then I was sitting there seeing videos of people being like, what is this? Like, what does it mean to be a WLW? Like, that was the first acronym I saw, which stands for Woman Loving Woman. I had no idea. And I was like, wait a second, I think that's me. And I just had no idea. And that was just from sitting in my room in quarantine and pre-COVID, just going through TikTok videos. That felt like a whole world just was like unlocked in a 10-second video that I just started to see more and more.
You know, for a long time, I was like, I just escaped one label. Why am I going to hop into another one? And for a long time, that's where I needed to be. And that was great. But what got me okay with embracing labels and really latching onto them was when I found a really affirming therapist. I was struggling a lot with finding the right therapist because a lot of them wouldn't use my pronouns, or they would look at me and be like, are you sure you're not a girl? Or are you sure you're not a boy? Or even just like, they're more on the tolerance side of things where they're like, I'm okay with you being queer in my space, but we're not going to talk about it. And once I found a therapist who was gay themselves, they helped me get top surgery and testosterone that I was seeking at the time. And they helped me with really accepting who I was. I was able to have those conversations with them, and I was able to also not have those conversations with them, and that was okay too.
It's so funny because I feel like if you go on like, I don't know, Therapy Today or whatever, and look up directories of therapists, every single therapist is like, I specialize in LGBTQ identities. And what they literally mean by that is they think that it's okay for LGBTQ folks to exist. And that is just like the lowest bar. Like, that is not what we are looking for from our therapists, right? We want folks who are not, I guess, just tolerant as a baseline, right? I want folks who will actively participate in my journey. I want folks who won't require me to educate them about my community. I want folks who meet me where I'm at. So it doesn't mean that every therapist has to themselves identify as LGBTQ, right? That's probably not the most accessible model because therapists are a limited bunch. But you got to be more than just like, I'm willing to go on this journey with you. You tell me how you identify and I'll meet you there.
In my experience, the way that I've found the best therapists was through different therapist find-in websites, like filtering for LGBTQ. And then you'll find a bunch of people who are like, I am okay with the fact that you exist. But you'll also find the people who talk about it like they know about it. And you just have to use your powers of deduction, but then also be willing to change therapists. My rule for myself personally is I'll go to 3 sessions with them. And then if I still don't like them after the 3rd, I will switch to a new one.
Yeah. And it happens, with some regularity, right? You're talking about a deeply personal relationship. So in a lot of ways, we're dating our therapists. I love your 3-date rule, and then deciding from there if you feel like that's a safe space or a healthy relationship for you. I'll also say you can find therapists in queer communities, right? Like the best therapists I've ever had were recommended to me by other LGBTQ folks who were like, oh my gosh, this therapist is amazing. And now that we're in the like digital age where video therapy is a lot more common, you aren't necessarily limited to your backyard or your city. You might be able to find an amazing therapist in North Dakota or an amazing therapist, in Texas or Florida, right? There's lots of different places where amazing therapists exist if you open up yourself to that. So yeah, I think there's a bit of a networking component here.
I think too, it's not as a young person who's on my parents' insurance still, it was a conversation I had to have with them too. That was kind of uncomfortable because they were like, a therapist is a therapist. They're all the same. Like they have a psych degree, like you're good for them. And I had to sit down with my mom and like kind of show her these things that we're talking about. Like, Mom, like I need an LGBTQ therapist. This is how we have to go through and Google it, because I couldn't like just sign up to go to this therapist myself. I had to go through like another channel, which was my parent. And I'm lucky in the aspect that she was okay with that. But I think for so many kids, maybe that parent isn't going to let them do that. They don't see the reason of going to a special therapist. So I think that's a whole nother conversation too, that can get difficult, but it's still so important.
Yeah, that's super important. A lot of times there's this term that comes from like, I don't know, boss manager environments, right? But I find value with your parents as well. Like a lot of growing up and getting older is managing up, is like helping your parents understand how to better support you. not all parents want or have good intentions for their kids, but I think a lot of parents do. And they think they're doing what's best and they're just not, right? Like they think they know what's best for you and they don't. And so we end up having to take those relationships and say, okay, I know you really well. And I need to figure out how to communicate a need to you that's not going to push any of your buttons or make you feel uncomfortable. And the more our parents meet us where we're at, the better. But sometimes they need a little bit of guidance, a little scaffolding to get them there, I find.
I completely agree, Chris. I think my mom at first, when I first came out to her on FaceTime, she thought I was joking, first of all. And that was like the worst reaction I ever wanted to hear. I just wanted her to say, yes, like you're good, nothing is wrong. And it took her that first year after to really understand. And she had good intentions. She was just like, I just have to get over this idea I had of you in my mind, marrying a man, having babies, living right down the road, all that like very cliche stuff that she had to get over herself. And it's funny, right before we started this podcast, I just got a text of a screenshot that she sent saying it was Pride Month. She had no idea what that was a year ago. And she's really trying to make these small little bits of her life that to me are a little corny, but I'm so happy that she's doing that. Like she just bought my cat those little pride mice from Target. And I was like, okay, Mom, I don't really need this. And I don't see totally the value in this, but I was so comforted that she was just learning and trying to see what she can do with the little knowledge that she has and the knowledge that she continues to still find for herself.
That's kind of adorable, even if it's not particularly helpful.
I still appreciate it. They're all over the house. That poses some interesting questions of kind of those who are in the community and those who are not. I think this is a question we in the community get asked all the time is like, what can I do as an ally? What can I do to support you? And I'm interested to hear your thoughts, Chris, because I only, coming out 2 years ago, I don't always know what to say. I don't know. You get this pressure to educate, as someone mentioned before earlier on the podcast. So I'm curious to see what are your thoughts and what do you say when you kind of get poised with this question of how we can advocate for change and acceptance in our community and those who are not in our community?
Well, I'm going to be super biased. I already told you I'm the director of public training at the Trevor Project, but I think education is such an important tool, and we do not have appropriate education around LGBTQ identities, LGBTQ families, LGBTQ parenting. There are just a million ways that we fall short in educating folks. And what's worse is we're in a time where really narrow prescriptions of what it means to be a human are being argued over, right? So like, you must believe like I believe, you must have the same ideas and concepts that I believe in. And if you don't, there is something evil or nefarious about your identities. The fact that that conversation is happening in the big world, right? When you have these micro conversations within families, you can start to take all that big cultural conversation and imprint it on your family members, right? Like if your parents are a little hesitant at first, what that feels like to you is this big cultural rejection that we're experiencing right now, when really maybe they just are surprised and they needed a moment to like catch their breath, or they're just really scared they're going to say the wrong thing. And then let's flip it again, because I'm a parent. If you're in the habit of not letting your children safely take risks in their lives, right? And say, I want to see who I am. I want to explore my identities. Then when your children start doing that, you might mislabel it as rebellion, or you might mislabel it as, oh, they don't really know who they are. Or you might mislabel it as, it's just a phase. Well, let me tell you, every LGBTQ young person out there hates being told it's just a phase, you're being rebellious, and how could you possibly know this about yourself? Because those questions are not being asked of cisgender and straight children. They are only being asked of us. And so when well-meaning folks respond that way, it super, super, super hurts. And that's just something that we need to address because this cultural divide is being sucked in and absorbed in our family levels. And it's really affecting how we relate to one another.
Sort of bouncing off that, I think something really important for allies to remember, just in addition, is that they will get it wrong sometimes. And that if they're fighting with us, they're gonna overstep and they're gonna say the wrong thing and they're gonna ask an offensive question. But what they need to do then is keep in mind that we need them to fight with us. And I can only speak for myself, but I would much prefer someone try and get it wrong than to not try at all. And when they do get it wrong, because it will happen, they just need to listen to us when we say that was wrong, and they need to step back and reevaluate and change their actions. But they're not going to learn until they get things wrong and until they mess up and until they try and fail and succeed and fail again and succeed again.
Yeah, that's so true. You know, when I think about allyship, I think about this litmus test for am I a good ally, which is, would the community that I align myself with consider me an ally? Because ally is an action word. It's not a label. And I think a lot of times we use it as an adjective for ourselves, but we don't take it to the extreme of what are the tangible action steps I must take in order to support this community and align with them. You know, I think about the civil rights movement in the United States. There were probably a lot of well-meaning white folks in the 50s, 60s, and 70s who maybe would say to their friends, you know, what's happening in this country around race isn't good, but would do absolutely nothing to change it. Here I am in California, right? A fairly progressive state. And the city that I grew up in, which is in Los Angeles County, they had segregated schools until the late 70s. And that is just something that I think we somehow forget, like, oh, most of the people alive today are a product of a lot of our history of passive allyship, where we say like, ooh, what's happening isn't right, but I'm not going to do anything, right? And so then change takes centuries, literal centuries. And so when I think about allyship today, I think about what are the active steps we can take to align with marginalized communities. And, you know, obviously take to align with communities other than our own identities.
I think that's helpful, Chris, for you to share on, because I think of just like this continuing education aspect of everyone in the community is not an expert on some of this, even if they identify with it themselves. For me, I've spent, of these 2 years since I'm coming out, this is the first Pride Month that I'm like celebrating per se. And I really want to take this month and really educate myself on things that I've been biased to and that my privilege has allowed me to kind of avoid up until this time. And it's just like, I sometimes listen along with these allies too, to protect people in my own community and stand for my own self. And just, I am just not guaranteed to know everything with my identity and saying who I am. I still have tons of questions myself. I have to learn to just making sure that like I'm being the best that I can be. So I appreciate you sharing that. And it's just, again, along this theme of this journey, it's just like this constant uphill battle that unfortunately we just have to deal with. And I wish it wasn't like that, but this is just kind of what comes along with it sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes so much sense. And also, it extra makes sense when you think about the LGBT community because there's so many different aspects of it. Like, there's no way you have all the identities within our community and yourself. And so you're going to sometimes potentially fail members of the LGBTQ community, even if you yourself are a member of the LGBTQ community. And that requires us to be malleable, to be open to feedback, and to listen and learn first before we just take up space. Because I think a big part of being an ally is learning. and educating yourself, not necessarily just running to do a thing.
I'm curious to see like self-care, something that I need to get better at. I always tell myself I need to take more time alone. I need to really reflect on some of these things that I'm going through. I've kind of come out, had my first and second long-term relationship all in the last like 2 years. And it took me a really long time. And I also came out at work, and that was a whole nother thing. And that's a lot going on. Those are a lot big, heavy life things that happened in 2 short years that I'm very quick to say, oh yeah, that happened. That happened. Like these are things that affect how we go about our day-to-day life. These are affecting our long-term mental health. And I think for me, I found a lot of kind of hidden passions that I didn't really know I had. I've gotten into cooking, I've gotten into reading and working out. And these are all like very cliche hobbies that I feel like before I came out and before I really accepted myself, I didn't even allow myself to even get there as I'm kind of just always felt so tense and so stressed, and is someone going to find out? Is someone going to know? But now I feel like I actually kind of just breathe and just let loose and just enjoy life as it is. And so I'm really curious as to see like, what have you both found that's kind of helped your own mental health through this journey, and what things do you continue to do that really help your mind and ease your mind?
I think for me, I feel like self-care is so regularly scheduled. It cannot be something that you only implement at times when you're stressed. And so one of the things that I do is I find like little projects or little things that I can put around the house that I can turn to just sort of regularly before I get too stressed. I'm a big fan of Lego sets. I just sort of sit there and build Lego sets as a form of self-care. I always, take my dog on walks and hikes. I'm a big fan of the national parks or just traveling, seeing outdoor spaces. So that's a big thing for me as well. I also would say for me personally, human connection is probably like one of the most healing things. So I just find regularly scheduled hangouts or spaces that I can be a part of with friends, people I care about, as a way to just sort of recharge and refresh and sort of restore that empathy bank that I have inside of myself. So those are all some things that I do. What about you two?
I am an artist. I do a lot of painting and drawing and, like all the arts. I find that it's a great way to figure out and express how I'm feeling before I even know how I'm feeling. Like I can just do a finger painting, which is my favorite way to get out emotions, is by finger painting. And I can look at it afterwards and go, oh yeah, that's exactly how I'm feeling. I had no idea, which I think is really interesting. And I love that.
That's great. I'm so inspired, Cicada. I have the worst artistic skills, and I so wish that I could have some sort of ability to express myself.
You know what?
I think
if I could respond to that real quick, sorry to interrupt.
Oh no, you're fine.
No skills necessary to create. You don't have to be good at something to do it. You can just have fun with it. Like the goal doesn't have to be a gallery. The goal can be just getting whatever's inside of you out. And then you never have to show anyone. You could throw it right in the trash afterwards. It's about the process and the making it, not about the final piece.
That's true. That's that's important.
If you want to try it, I think you should.
Thank you. I actually really needed to hear that on today of all days so I do that sometimes with sports. I've tried to really use tennis as an outlet. I just there's like a giant wall that I have. I just kind of go at it. I'm horrible at it. And if anyone were to see me, they'd be laughing. They'd be like, oh, she's terrible. But that's for me, that has been great. And just going outside and getting sun and some vitamin C has really helped my own mental health. But completely with you there on Cicada on the skill.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Chris. This has been a really interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you for having me. It has been a pleasure, and I hope that we can connect again in the future. You two are lovely.
Well, that was a really interesting conversation, and I'm so excited that we had it, and I feel just like a sponge,
Yeah, I think something that I've learned from this conversation is we talked about really hard things that we have to inherently go through. not just Cicada, myself, and Chris, but for probably centuries of people, LGBTQ people before us, even speaking on this podcast. So there's a lot of challenges that we go through. There are a lot of uphill battles that are still not yet things we don't even know about yet. This conversation really reminds me of how proud I am of myself and where I've come on my journey and where I still am yet to go. I don't know everything about myself yet. I don't know the perfect answer to every question I get about being a member of the LGBTQ community, but I really am in a moment of my life right now where I really just want to celebrate myself and my identity and the identities of those around me who are willing to share and are open about that.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you tune in again for Real Talk with Gen Z. I know we will.